My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until recently, I believed my life was settled in a way that people spend years chasing. Not perfect, not glamorous, but solid, predictable in the best sense of the word. The kind of future you could picture clearly enough to stop being afraid of it. 3 months before my wedding, that future cracked open in my kitchen, quietly, without shouting, without drama, while the coffee was still hot and the morning light hadn't fully burned off the Florida humidity. If you had asked me the week before whether my relationship was in danger, I would have laughed. Not because we were flawless, but because we were done searching. We'd already chosen each other, or at least that's what I thought. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how someone can spend one day talking about seating charts and honeymoon plans, and the next asking for permission to step outside the life you were building together. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, not at first. I just sat there, listening to him speak, thinking there had to be another meaning hiding beneath his words, a different explanation my brain hadn't caught up to yet. There wasn't. I was engaged to Ethan Brooks for 6 months. We'd been together for 3 years total. He worked in a creative field, charismatic, expressive, the kind of man who could talk his way into opportunities and out of accountability just as smoothly. I worked in software sales, recently promoted to director, the steady one, the planner, the person who liked knowing where things were headed. We balanced each other. That's what everyone said. That's what I believed. We owned a house together in Tampa, bought it 2 years earlier, back when interest rates were lower and optimism felt endless. 3 bedrooms, a yard big enough for imaginary future kids, or at least a dog we kept talking about but never committed to. Walking distance to restaurants we loved. A place that felt grown up in a way neither of us had felt before. Our wedding was scheduled for early spring. Invitations were designed, vendors booked, deposits paid. My dress hung in a garment bag at my sister's place because Ethan didn't want bad luck in the house. Up until 2 weeks ago, I thought I had won the relationship lottery. The morning everything changed didn't announce itself as important. No argument, no tension. Just Ethan sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a look I couldn't immediately name. Not guilt, not anger. Resolve. I need to talk to you about something, he said. That sentence alone made my stomach tighten. He didn't reach for my hand. Didn't soften his voice. He folded his fingers together like he was preparing to negotiate a contract. He told me he'd been thinking about us, about getting married, and that he wanted a break. A break. When I asked what kind, he hesitated just long enough to confirm my fear. His ex had reached out. Lena, his college girlfriend, the one he'd always described as immature, dramatic, a phase. The woman who, despite supposedly being in his past, had never fully disappeared from the edges of his life, liking his photos, watching his stories, occasionally resurfacing in anecdotes I'd learned not to ask too many questions about. He said he needed to explore it, just to be sure. Sure of what, I wondered, when we were already engaged and building a life. He framed it as certainty, as honesty, as something healthy. Healthy, like being put on hold while the man I was supposed to marry tested whether something better existed. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not heartbreak. Recognition. I had been here before, years ago, with someone else. The reliable option. The safe choice. The person asked to wait while someone else explored. I promised myself I would never be that woman again. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized this wasn't confusion on his part. It was entitlement. I didn't take the ring off right away. After Ethan went quiet, after his shock turned into something like wounded pride, I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the small indentation on my left hand where the band had been sitting for 6 months. My finger felt lighter than it should have, exposed, like a truth had been pulled into the open before I was ready to name it. I walked through the house instead. Not dramatically, not with the intention of packing or leaving, just moving, room to room, as if I could confirm that the life we'd built still existed if I saw it from enough angles. The living room still smelled faintly like the candle Ethan insisted on lighting every night, the one he said made the space feel intentional. The couch we'd spent 3 weekends debating over sat exactly where it always had, angled just enough to catch the afternoon light. The accent wall behind it was still that deep slate blue we'd compromised on after hours of back and forth. I remembered how proud he'd been when friends complimented it, how he'd taken credit for the idea even though it had been mine. At the time, I'd laughed. We'd met 3 years earlier at a networking event downtown. I was there because my company was sponsoring it. He was there promoting his freelance creative work, charming a small crowd with the kind of confidence that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. I noticed him before we spoke, not because he was the loudest, but because he seemed so sure of himself, so at ease occupying space. When we finally started talking, it felt effortless. He asked questions, listened, made jokes that weren't trying too hard. He talked about creativity like it was oxygen. I talked about structure and strategy and building long-term relationships and sales. Somehow, instead of clashing, it fit. He pulled me into his world of gallery openings and late-night design sessions. I introduced him to client dinners and industry conferences. We told ourselves we were broadening each other. Looking back, I can see where I softened, where I adjusted, where I carried more of the weight because I was better at it. When we bought the house together 2 years in, it felt like a milestone earned, not rushed. We sat on the floor of the empty living room that first night, drinking champagne from mismatched mugs because we hadn't unpacked anything yet. I remember him leaning back against the wall, smiling at nothing. "This is real," he said. "This is us." I believed him. I believed him when we talked about the future like it was inevitable, when he said he wanted stability with me, when he joked about how boring married life would be, but said it affectionately, like boredom was a luxury he couldn't wait to afford. The proposal came a year and a half later, thoughtful, public enough to feel intentional, private enough to feel sincere. I said yes without hesitation, because in my mind, we'd already chosen each other long ago. That's the part that hurts the most. Not that he had doubts. Doubts are human. It's that somewhere along the way, I mistook comfort for commitment. And I mistook consistency for certainty. There had been signs, small ones, moments I'd brushed aside because they didn't fit the narrative I wanted. How he needed reassurance more often than I did. How he thrived on attention in a way that made me slightly uneasy, but never enough to confront. How he framed his past relationships as mistakes other people made. And Lena. She'd always been present in the background, like static I'd learned to tune out. When her name came up, it was always dismissive, always followed by a laugh. I told myself that meant she didn't matter. But people don't ask for breaks to explore things that don't matter. Standing in our bedroom, looking at the neatly made bed, I felt the weight of everything I'd invested, not just time, but trust, emotional labor, the quiet work of choosing the same person every day without needing to test alternatives. I realized something then that settled deep in my chest. I hadn't lost my future that morning. I'd lost the illusion that it was mutual. The proposal had felt inevitable by the time it happened. Not rushed, not pressured, just aligned. Like the natural next step in a relationship that had already crossed every meaningful threshold. Ethan had always known exactly how to frame moments, how to turn ordinary settings into something that felt intentional. That day was no different. He suggested we take a walk through a small park near downtown, one of those places tucked between old buildings and newer developments, where the trees were mature enough to cast real shade and the benches faced just enough architectural detail to feel curated instead of accidental. I didn't think much of it. We walked there often. He liked the way the light filtered through the branches. I liked that it was quiet enough to talk. He was in a good mood that morning, relaxed, engaged, talking about a new project he was excited about, breaking down design choices the way he always did, color theory, balance, how the smallest details shape perception without people realizing it. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be with someone who cared so deeply about what he did. We sat on a bench halfway through the park. He pointed out the mix of architectural styles across the street, explaining how different eras of construction created this unintentional visual timeline. I watched his hands move as he talked, the confidence in his voice, the ease. That's when he stopped mid-sentence, turned toward me, and knelt. For a split second, I laughed, not because I thought it was a joke, but because my brain hadn't caught up with what my eyes were seeing. "Are you serious right now?" I asked. He smiled, wide and nervous in a way I'd never seen before. Then he opened the box. The ring was beautiful, simple, elegant, exactly my taste. Something I could wear every day without feeling like it was wearing me. "Yes," I said before he even finished asking. "Yes, absolutely yes." He laughed then, relieved, pulled me into a hug so tight I could feel his heartbeat racing. People nearby clapped. Someone took a photo. It felt like one of those moments you're supposed to remember forever. For the next few months, we lived in wedding planning mode. Ethan was fully in his element, designing invitations, coordinating colors, talking aesthetics with vendors like they were collaborators instead of contractors. He had a vision, and watching him bring it to life was impressive. I handled the logistics he didn't want to think about, budgets, timelines, deposits, happy to support the process because it felt like we were building something together. He'd asked my opinion, but I noticed something then that I didn't fully register until later. When he was certain about something, there was no room for discussion. When he wasn't, he needed constant reassurance. I told myself that was normal, that everyone approaches commitment differently, that his need for validation didn't mean a lack of love, it meant fear. And fear is something you work through together. The ring became part of me. I stopped noticing it on my hand, the way you stop noticing something once it belongs. Friends commented on how calm I seemed during planning, how grounded. "You look so sure," my sister said once, smiling. I was. That was the difference between us. I never needed to explore alternatives to be certain. I didn't need to test my feelings against someone else's attention. I didn't need a comparison. I had chosen. Looking back now, I can see the imbalance clearly. How I leaned into the future while he hovered near it, close enough to touch, but always keeping one foot behind him. At the time, I mistook that hesitation for thoughtfulness. I thought his questions meant depth. I didn't realize they were warning signs. The kitchen had always been my favorite room in the house. Morning light poured in through the windows at just the right angle, warming the counters and turning everything soft before the day fully woke up. It was where we had our best conversations, where plans were made casually, between sips of coffee and half-listened to news playing from someone's phone. That morning felt the same, until it didn't. I was making breakfast, moving on autopilot. Eggs in the pan, coffee brewing, the comfortable rhythm of routine. Ethan sat down across from me, but instead of pulling out his phone or making some comment about work, he just watched me. That was the first thing that felt off. "I need to talk to you about something," he said again, slower this time. I set the spatula down and sat across from him, my pulse picking up despite my effort to stay calm. "What's going on?" He took a breath, not the shaky kind, the prepared kind. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, "about getting married." I nodded, waiting. "And I think before we do that, we should take a break." There it was. The word sat between us, awkward and undefined. "A break," I repeated carefully, as in time apart. "Yes," he said, "space, perspective." "For what purpose?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough to confirm my worst suspicion. Lena reached out to me. My chest tightened. "She's been thinking about me," he continued, "about us. And honestly, I've been thinking about her too." I felt like I was watching the conversation from outside my body. Like if I stayed still enough, quiet enough, the meaning would rearrange itself into something less devastating. "I think," he said, "that before we get married, I should explore those feelings, just to be sure." "Be sure of what?" I asked. "Of us," he replied quickly, "of my decision." The audacity of that landed hard. "You're asking to pause our engagement," I said slowly, "so you can see if you still want your ex-girlfriend." "It's not just about sex," he said immediately. "It's about clarity. Don't you want me to be completely certain before committing forever?" I stared at him. Because the thing was, I was certain. I had been for a long time, and I'd assumed, foolishly, that certainty was mutual. "How long?" I asked. "Maybe a month, 2 at most." "And during that time," I said, "what do I do?" He looked almost relieved that I wasn't yelling. "Wait," he said. "Think about us. Reflect. It'll be good for both of us." Wait. Like I was a bookmark he could return to after finishing another chapter. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You want me to sit here, still engaged to you, while you figure out whether something better exists." "That's not fair," he said. "I'm trying to be honest instead of cheating." "And I'm trying to understand how honesty turned into entitlement," I replied. He started talking faster then, explaining, justifying, saying things like fear of commitment, old feelings, better now than later, as if those phrases made the request reasonable. But I could see it clearly now. This wasn't uncertainty. This was permission-seeking. I thought about every moment I'd chosen him without hesitation, every time I shut down outside interest because it didn't matter, every time I invested deeper instead of keeping options open. And I realized something cold and undeniable. "No," I said. He blinked. "No. What?" "No breaks," I replied. "We're either getting married or we're not. If you want to explore other people, then we're done." The color drained from his face. "Naomi, that's not fair," he said. "I love you. I just need to be sure." "And I am sure," I said quietly. "I'm sure I won't be anyone's backup plan." He started crying then, real tears, saying I was being unreasonable, that he was trying to protect our future, that he didn't want to cheat, that this was hard for him too. I listened without interrupting. Then I reached for my left hand, slid the ring off, and placed it gently on the table between us. The engagement is over, I said. You can't be serious, he whispered. Dead serious. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. I expected to feel something dramatic the moment the ring left my hand. Shock, devastation, panic. Instead, what I felt was stillness, the kind that comes after a decision so clear it quiets every other thought. Ethan stared at the ring on the table like it was a foreign object, like it had betrayed him. His hands hovered uselessly in his lap, unsure whether to reach for it, for me or for nothing at all. You're being impulsive, he said finally, his voice shaking. We don't have to do this right now. We already did, I replied. He stood up and began pacing, running his hands through his hair, talking faster the way he always did when control slipped away from him. I'm just asking for honesty, he said. I could have lied, I could have cheated, I didn't. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for you, I said, not for me. He stopped pacing. You're really going to throw everything away over this? The question landed differently than he intended, because in that moment I understood something with terrifying clarity. I wasn't throwing anything away. I was refusing to beg for what should have been freely given. I thought back to a relationship I'd been in years earlier, one I rarely spoke about. The man who told me he loved me but needed space. Who asked me to wait while he figured himself out. Who always came back just long enough to keep me invested, but never long enough to commit. I remembered how small I'd felt, how patient I'd tried to be, how I'd convinced myself that loyalty meant endurance. I promised myself when that relationship ended that I would never do that again. Ethan wiped at his face, voice cracking. I love you, Naomi. I believe you, I said, but love that hesitates isn't enough for me anymore. He looked stunned by that, like it hadn't occurred to him that love could be insufficient. Lena just brought things up I thought I'd already moved past, he said. I didn't expect it to feel like this. And when she reached out, I asked, why didn't you shut it down? He opened his mouth, closed it. That answer told me everything I needed to know. You didn't want certainty, I said. You wanted permission. He started crying harder then, saying he'd made a mistake, that he didn't want to lose me, that he could block her, cut contact, forget the whole thing. But that wasn't the point. The damage wasn't that he had feelings. The damage was that when faced with a choice between protecting our future and indulging his curiosity, he chose curiosity. I'm done listening to explanations for why our 3 years together weren't enough to make you sure about me, I said. I stood up. This doesn't have to be ugly, I added, but it is over. He sank back into his chair, defeated. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small, not tragic, just exposed. I spent the rest of the day doing things that felt surreal in their normalcy. Calling vendors, canceling appointments, explaining, briefly, politely, that the wedding was off. Some were sympathetic, some were efficient. A few mentioned cancellation fees. I didn't care. That evening, my brother Caleb came over. He didn't ask many questions. He just grabbed boxes and started helping me pack. You sure about this? He asked at one point, folding one of my dresses carefully. He asked me to wait while he figured out if he wanted me, I said. Caleb didn't hesitate. What exactly are you supposed to be unsure about? That was all the confirmation I needed. By Sunday night, the house was listed. By Monday morning, I'd called my company about a transfer. There was an opening in Austin that had been sitting vacant for months. For the first time since that kitchen conversation, I felt something close to relief. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I knew, without a single doubt, that I had chosen myself. The speed at which everything unraveled surprised even me. Once the decision was made, there was no hesitation left to cling to, no romanticized grief, just logistics, clean, brutal, necessary. The house listing went live Sunday night. By Tuesday morning, there were 3 showings scheduled. Ethan had retreated into a version of himself I barely recognized, quieter, wounded, still shocked that consequences had arrived without asking his permission. He stayed mostly in the guest room, giving me space I hadn't asked for but no longer needed. We didn't fight. That was the strangest part. There were no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, just silence layered with the dull understanding that something fundamental had broken and neither of us could fix it without pretending. I called the photographer first, then the florist, then the venue coordinator. Each call followed the same script. Yes, the wedding has been canceled. No, there's no reschedule. Yes, I understand the policy. A few offered condolences. One asked if I was okay. I thanked them politely and moved on. By the third call, my voice stopped shaking. Caleb took 3 days off work without asking. He showed up with coffee, boxes, and the kind of quiet competence that made everything feel manageable. "What do you want to keep?" he asked, standing in the living room. I looked around at the furniture we'd chosen together. The art. The rug Ethan had insisted on because it anchored the room. "Not much," I said. "We donated most of it." It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I didn't want to carry reminders of a life that had required me to shrink parts of myself just to keep it intact. By Wednesday, I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor. By Thursday, most of my things were in storage. Ethan tried to talk to me once more that week. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," he said quietly, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. That sentence told me everything. He hadn't expected resolve. He'd expected hesitation. "I meant what I said," I replied. "This isn't a scare tactic." He nodded slowly, like someone accepting a loss they hadn't believed was possible. The house sold faster than either of us anticipated. A cash offer came in within 48 hours, below market, but clean and fast. I accepted without countering. Ethan objected briefly. "We could wait," he said. "Get more." "I don't want more," I replied. "I want out." He didn't argue after that. Friday morning, I signed the papers and officially became untethered. By that afternoon, my company had approved the transfer. Austin. New territory, new apartment, already furnished, and waiting. That night, I stayed in a hotel, my things packed, my past sealed behind me. Caleb brought Thai food and a bottle of wine. We sat on the bed, cartons balanced between us. "You okay?" he asked. I thought about it. "Better than I expected," I said honestly. "I keep waiting to feel devastated." And mostly I feel relieved. He nodded. "Relieved how?" "Like I've been holding my breath for a long time without realizing it," I said. "Trying to be enough, interesting enough, exciting enough." "And now?" "Now I don't have to audition for my own life." He smiled at that. Friday evening, my phone started buzzing. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Ethan. Panic had finally caught up to him. I didn't answer. Because by then, I was already halfway out of Florida, driving west, windows down, the city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror. And for the first time in months, I wasn't looking back. I didn't hear about what happened at the house until much later. At the time, I was already 3 hours into the drive, podcast humming softly through the speakers, the highway stretching forward in a way that felt almost symbolic. My phone was on silent, face down in the cup holder, vibrating occasionally with notifications I had no intention of reading. Ethan, meanwhile, was finally understanding the weight of what he'd asked for. Apparently, he and Lena had planned to stop by the house Friday afternoon. Not to move anything, not to talk logistics. To look. Caleb told me later that Ethan had admitted it without shame. He wanted to show her our life. The house. The stability. The future he'd been so casual about risking. Maybe he thought it would impress her. Maybe he thought it would make her see what she'd won. Instead, they pulled up to a sold sign staked into the front yard. A moving truck was parked at the curb, loading the last of the donated furniture. The house, our house, was no longer his to offer anyone. That's when the calls started. Voicemails first, then texts, then missed calls stacked so tightly they blurred together. I listened to them days later, alone in my new apartment, curiosity outweighing restraint. "I thought you were just trying to scare me. I didn't think you'd actually leave. We can fix this. I choose you, Naomi. I choose us." I didn't reply. Because the point had never been whether he could choose me after everything fell apart. It was what he did before it did. Caleb handled most of the fallout. Friends calling him, confused. Family members asking what happened. People trying to piece together a story that didn't match the version Ethan had apparently been telling himself. His mother called Caleb one evening, voice shaking. "She asked you to wait while she did what?" she asked after he explained. "Explore her feelings for her ex," Caleb said. There was a long pause. "Oh," she finally said. "Well, then you were right to leave." Even the people who loved him most couldn't defend that. By Sunday, I was settled into my apartment in Austin. Downtown view, bare walls, quiet. Caleb sent updates I hadn't asked for but didn't mind receiving. Ethan showing up at his place unannounced. Crying. Demanding to know where I'd gone. Saying he never meant for things to go this far. But he still didn't understand what mattered most. Intent didn't change impact. He'd made a series of choices that led directly to this outcome. The only surprise was that I'd followed through. The most ironic detail came from a mutual friend a week later. Lena had backed off almost immediately. The moment Ethan was fully available, no engagement, no house, no future neatly packaged, her interest cooled. The chase was gone. The validation complete. Turns out she hadn't wanted him. She'd wanted to win. That knowledge didn't make me feel smug. It made me feel certain I hadn't lost something valuable. I'd stepped away from something fragile, something that would have cracked the moment life demanded more than curiosity and charm. And as I unpacked boxes in a city that felt unfamiliar but full of possibility, I realized something quietly profound. The silence on my phone wasn't loneliness. It was peace. Austin had begun to feel like mine. Not home, not yet, but familiar enough that my body no longer tensed when I stepped outside. I had a routine. Morning runs along the trail, coffee from the same place 2 blocks down where the barista remembered my order, long workdays that ended with a quiet satisfaction instead of emotional exhaustion. That was why it took me a second to recognize the man sitting on the steps outside my apartment complex. At first, my brain rejected the idea entirely. I slowed, squinting against the sun, thinking it had to be someone else. A trick of distance, a coincidence. Then he stood. Naomi. It wasn't a quick drive. It was the kind of trip you only make when denial finally collapses. And there Ethan was, uninvited, unannounced, carrying the kind of desperation that only shows up when consequences arrive all at once. You can't be here, I said, stopping several feet away. I had to see you, he replied. His voice was hoarse. Please, just 5 minutes. He looked worse than I remembered. Not dramatically, just worn. Dark circles under his eyes, clothes that didn't quite sit right, like he'd stopped caring how things came together. I should have turned around, but I didn't want a scene, and part of me wanted this chapter sealed properly. 5 minutes, I said, inside. The apartment was smaller than the house in Tampa, but brighter, less curated, more honest. He noticed immediately, looking around like someone realizing the set had changed without his approval. This is nice, he said, surprised. I didn't respond. What do you want, Ethan? He didn't sit, just stood there, hands clasped like he was holding himself together. I made a mistake, he said, the biggest mistake of my life. I waited. It wasn't what I thought, he continued quickly. With Lena, it lasted 2 weeks. 2, and then she was done. You were right about everything. I know, I said. That startled him. I didn't come here to hear apologies, I added. So if that's all you have. I've been seeing a therapist, he blurted, working on my fear of commitment, my tendency to self-sabotage when things get real. That's good, I said. And I meant it. I want to fix this, he said. I want us back. There it was. The offer he thought would still matter. He talked for a long time after that, about how scared he'd been, how Lena had manipulated him, told him he was settling, that he'd always wonder what if, how those words worked, because part of him wanted them to. He told me he hadn't slept, that his work had suffered, that everything in Tampa reminded him of what he'd lost. I'll do anything, he said. Move here, sign a prenup, start over, prove it. I listened without interruption. And that's when I realized something I hadn't expected. I felt nothing. No anger, no longing, no pull. Just a quiet sadness, for him, not for us. What we had required me to be smaller than I am, I said finally. And you needed me to stay that way so you could feel certain. That's not true, he said quickly. It is, I replied calmly. You didn't want partnership. You wanted security with optional excitement. He looked like I'd struck him. I loved you, he said. You loved what I represented, I corrected. There's a difference. The conversation lasted 2 hours. He cried, he pleaded, he promised. And I stayed exactly where I was, steady, unmoved. When he finally left, I stood on the balcony and watched his car disappear into traffic. I waited for something to break inside me. Nothing did. What I felt instead was gratitude for the woman who had trusted her instincts, for the version of me that didn't negotiate her worth, for leaving when staying would have meant abandoning myself. Sometimes closure doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with the absence of pain. I didn't start dating right away. Not because I was broken, but because I was finally quiet. For the first time in years, my life didn't feel like something I needed to explain or justify to another person. My time belonged to me. My evenings were peaceful. My decisions didn't require negotiation. And that was addictive. Work in Austin accelerated quickly. The territory was more competitive than Tampa, but it suited me. People here moved fast, spoke directly, expected competence. I thrived in that environment. Within a few months, I was on track for the strongest numbers of my career. That was when I met Daniel Wright. It wasn't dramatic. No sparks flying across a crowded room, no immediate chemistry that made my heart race. We met at a professional mixer. Ironic, given how my last serious relationship began. But the difference was immediate. Daniel wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress. He was simply present. He worked in operations for a growing tech firm downtown. Practical, observant, calm in a way that didn't demand attention but earned it. We talked for almost an hour before I even noticed how much time had passed. When he asked me out, there was no hesitation, no ambiguity, no let's see where this goes energy. Just clarity. Dating him felt steady, not boring, not predictable. Steady in the way solid ground feels steady after years of walking on something that shifted beneath you. I told him about Ethan early on, not in detail, not with bitterness, just enough to be honest. When I finished, Daniel shook his head once and said, "Thank God he did you that favor." That was it. No defensiveness, no jealousy, no probing questions disguised as concern. He didn't need to compete with my past because he wasn't insecure about his place in my present. That difference changed everything. I wasn't wondering if I was enough. I wasn't monitoring my tone. I wasn't adjusting myself to keep someone engaged. I was chosen, deliberately, consistently, without conditions. That's when it hit me. How much emotional energy I'd been spending before just to maintain balance in a relationship that never fully rested on solid ground. Love isn't supposed to feel like a performance review. With Daniel, it didn't. Months later, on what would have been my wedding date, I received a text from a number I hadn't blocked yet. "I still think about you every day. I hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I blocked the number. Some conversations don't deserve replies. Through Caleb and a few remaining mutual connections, I heard pieces of what Ethan's life looked like now. Short relationships, lingering reputation, a pattern repeating itself exactly the way I'd predicted. When someone shows you who they are under pressure, believe them. I had. And because of that, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something better, without fear, without hesitation, without the need to explore alternatives. It's been a full year since I left Florida. A year since I packed my life into boxes, drove west with no real plan beyond survival, and trusted myself enough to walk away from something that looked perfect on paper but felt wrong in my bones. Austin isn't just where I landed. It's where I became myself again. 6 months ago, I was promoted to regional sales director, covering Texas and Louisiana. The work is demanding, competitive, and exactly the kind of challenge I didn't realize I'd been craving. I'm making about 30% more than I was in Tampa, and for the first time in my career, I don't feel like I'm proving anything. I'm just doing the work. Well, Daniel and I are talking about moving in together next month. His lease is up. Mine runs through the summer. The timing makes sense, not because we're rushing, but because neither of us is afraid of building something real. That difference still amazes me. Love doesn't feel urgent when it's right. It doesn't feel conditional. It doesn't ask you to wait while someone checks their options. Through Caleb and a few remaining mutual connections, I've heard what Ethan's life looks like now. The story didn't surprise me. After Lana, there were others. Short-lived relationships that burned bright and collapsed quickly. Word travels fast in places like Tampa, especially when someone's personal choices become cautionary tales. People talk. When potential partners hear that he asked his fiancée to wait while he explored feelings for his ex, they see red flags. They see instability. They see someone who doesn't know what he wants. And worse, someone willing to hurt others while figuring it out. His career stalled. His social circle thinned. The charm that once worked so effortlessly lost its power when it wasn't backed by consistency. His parents were deeply embarrassed, not because the wedding was canceled, but because they'd believed in him. They'd believed he was ready. His father apparently told Caleb once, "She was the best thing that ever happened to him," and he threw it away. That sentence stuck with me, not because it validated me, but because it reminded me how close I came to tying my life to someone who would always be chasing the next possibility, instead of protecting what was already real. Ethan reached out one last time months ago, through an email this time, after realizing his number was blocked. It was long, reflective, full of words like growth and regret and clarity. I didn't respond. Some lessons aren't reinforced through conversation. They're learned through absence. What I've come to understand is this. The right person doesn't need to compare. They don't need to explore. They don't need a backup plan. They choose you, and they keep choosing you, especially when it's hard. I think about my father sometimes, how he used to say that actions reveal priorities better than words ever could. Ethan's actions told me everything I needed to know. And my actions, leaving, trusting myself, refusing to negotiate my worth, told me something even more important. I didn't lose a future. I avoided the wrong one.